Hey, honest question. Did it make you a tiny bit uncomfortable yesterday when I jokingly drew lots at the beginning of our conversation to determine what I was going to do next? Because it did me a teeny tiny little bit. It feels like, well, that's some kind of forbidden practice. It's divination or leaving something to chance. And, okay, obviously that was pretty tongue-in-cheek. Well, I think it was tongue-in-cheek. I don't know what I would have done if I'd drawn the one with the yellow sticker or not, as I promised. But theoretically, it was tongue-in-cheek to just illustrate a point. But even that was enough for me to be like, yeah, it feels weird. And I was kind of raised not to do that because the Bible looks like is against divination. And so that like borders on something that's forbidden, right? But then you actually go and read through the Bible, and the practice of drawing lots, which is what I did yesterday, doesn't look like it is overtly condemned when it actually happens. In fact, it looks like at times God uses weird things throughout the biblical narrative to communicate stuff he wanted to communicate, or to give people a sense of direction or certainty within the boundaries of providential decisions that he's already made and is known since the dawn of time. Is this an overwhelming way to get started on things? I've taken a little bit of medicine for my cold today. I don't want it to be overwhelming. But this question that Esther chapter 3 raises for us as Haman goes and casts the die, as he casts lots to determine what the appointed time is going to be to take action against the Jewish people. The question that is brought up by this is one that takes us into the outer realms of thought about the relationship between reality and time and decisions, that is what happens, and a God who is held out in the Bible, and I think by reason, as knowing everything, never having learned anything, being surprised by nothing, and not just knowing what has happened, what is happening, and what will happen, but knowing what could have happened, what might happen now, and what could happen in the future, and all possible deviations and permutations that could come out of that. The infinite mind of God and his necessary, infinite, limitless knowledge of everything that is or could be or might have been is really one of the truly mind-boggling aspects of existence and theology, and of trying to study and talk about a document that is the Bible that has humans interacting with this God who has that kind of knowledge and that kind of power. And people, for more or less all of human history, and as much as we're aware of anyway, have been using these kind of little tricks, these little items and trinkets to try to get unstuck and make decisions about things big and little. And if you go and you dig into the definition of all the different terms that get used around this sort of using stuff to figure out what to choose or where fate will take you or where God will take you, you'll see the term kleromancy. We've been talking about that. Casting lots falls under the historic category of kleromancy. There are other kinds of mancies as well that consult things that aren't fate and aren't God, or that use other trickier, sometimes much darker methods to try to consult those things. That isn't really what I'm talking about here. We're talking about casting lots. And again, if you were raised around church at all, I think casting lots is something that is supposed to sort of make you feel uncomfortable. Maybe it'd be something that you would liken to a Ouija board, but the Bible seems to treat those as being two separate categories. So for example, it's not a good look when King Saul, earlier in the Old Testament, goes and consults the witch of Endor and wants to summon back to life the prophet who he sparred with for so many years of his own life. That feels weird and out of bounds. But so often when lots are cast in the Bible, the text is either ambiguous toward it in terms of whether or not that was a good idea, or relatively positive toward it, indicating that the outcome was correct or that somehow God did provide direction through that thing. Let me give you a few examples. One, in the book of Jonah. Remember early on, Jonah's on the boat and he wants to go to Tarshish, the furthest thing away that he can possibly get to, as opposed to Nineveh, the great Assyrian city of evil. He didn't want to go prophesy there. And along the way, a big storm comes up and the sailors are all like, hey, there's something divine about this. And so they cast lots to figure out whose fault it is, and it lands on Jonah, and Jonah's like, yeah, you got me, it is my fault, I'm running from God, but it'll get better if you throw me overboard. Well, one, the lots pick the right guy, and two, when they throw him overboard, the storm goes away. So that looks like God confirming true things through the use of lots. Let's jump forward to the New Testament. What would this be? End of Acts chapter 1? The disciples are down one dude. Judas is out of the game because he hung himself weird and split himself in half. And now they've got some new candidates that they're considering. And apparently they're not quite sure who to pick. It's kind of a goofy in-between moment in the history of God's relationship with humanity, because it doesn't look like he's in the temple. He's not there with them in the form of the physical presence of Christ, but the Holy Spirit isn't going to show up until the next day. So here they are. What do? Well, they resort back to this age-old practice of claromancy to determine who ought to be the next disciple to fill their ranks in anticipation of the Holy Spirit showing up real soon. And it falls on a guy named Matthias, which I think is rad because it means there are two Matts in the disciples, bringing us into a tie for the most disciple-y name of all time. I mean, they prayed first, they asked God for guidance, and then they just rolled with it. How about the Old Testament prediction in the Psalms that at some point they were going to cast lots to divide up the belongings of the Messiah? And then indeed, when we get to the New Testament and see the story of Jesus, the centurions, they do cast lots to decide who gets to keep Jesus' robe. And there's nothing there that indicates they shouldn't have cast lots. Maybe it's pretty weird and crass that they're doing that over Jesus' robe, but it happens, and the text is ambiguous toward the actual practice there. We know from 1 Chronicles 24, I didn't write it down. I think that's right. I'm pretty sure it's right. I just looked it up a minute ago. That priestly duties were distributed by the casting of lots. There's nothing in 1 Chronicles. It's like, but you shouldn't have been doing that. No, 1 Chronicles is a relatively positive framing of the good stuff about what had been going on in the age of the kings and ages earlier. Presumably that practice was still in place in the Gospel of Luke, when Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, gets selected to perform priestly duties that year. There's no condemnation in any of those places for the casting of lots. How about this? Something as decisive as how the Holy Land would be divided up after the conquest. Joshua casts lots over a very lengthy process to determine which tribe was going to get which chunk of land. That's a huge deal in terms of how history plays out. And really, that geography factors into God's redemptive plan. It looks like he used the casting of lots to put the players on the board where he wanted the players to be. How about Judges 19, 20, 21? Is it 3 chapters? I think it is. It's one of the most shocking stories in the whole Bible. It's about the Benjamite War. And the leaders of the rest of the tribes of Israel who prosecute the Benjamite War, they draw lots to figure out how exactly to prosecute that and who will lead into battle on a given day. The casting of lots is prescribed in Leviticus chapter 16 for how to select the scapegoat to send out into the desert to take the sins of the people away from them. Nehemiah 10 has, at worst, an ambiguous, but I think you could argue positive framing of the use of the casting of lots and sorting out some of the mess and the return from exile. Then you got the really goofy system between Jacob and Laban that resulted in Jacob sort of tricking Laban into building his own flock. You've got the casting of lots for determination regarding Achan's sin, who inappropriately took plunder. And that's just the list that I sat here and sketched out and brainstormed a second before I jumped on the microphone. Probably some of you have thought of some other ones as well. So weirdly, God seems to use this. The Christian could say, well, now we have the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit provides guidance. And so you don't need to do things this way. But Christians through the millennia have still used some form of the casting of lots to make decisions. The Copts, that is the Egyptian Orthodox Church, they recently picked their pope, maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago, using drawing of lots, at least in some part of the process. The Russian Orthodox have done this, unless you be like, well, yeah, those aren't Protestants. The Protestants are the ones who get this right. Well, I happen to like Protestantism an awful lot, but one of the rock stars of early Protestantism, Count von Zinzendorf, famously used the casting of lots to determine where to make his next move, where to build his next community, what ministry thing to do next. So I think the knee-jerk reaction to this is to be like, well, the Bible is always against the casting of lots in any way. But if you actually go and look at the examples where it comes up, this is one of the places where my instinct about the Bible runs a little bit counter to what I actually see on the page. But the point of this conversation is not for me to try to solve once and for all, if you're a follower of God, should you cast lots or not? I don't know. I don't think I do this. At least not consciously, or not very much. I know other people who maybe would say, hey, pray it out all the way through and try to seek God's will. And if there is no clarity on that, but you have to make a decision, do something that is reminiscent of what people who followed God did in the Bible, which is to cast lots. I don't know. I don't really want to give any advice on that. I don't know what you ought to do. What I do know is that by looking at other examples of places where lots were cast and it was either ambiguous in the text or positive, we can maybe get a little better sense of how the original audience is reading Esther and how we're supposed to feel about this casting of lots. Because if we view this as something that is always bad and something that dark diviners do, then it almost becomes detached from the providential theme of the book of Esther and how his will supersedes everything. But if we look at it as something that God has demonstrated that he can use, even if it is an odd technique, an odd, quirky thing, then what we see instead here is that maybe on accident, Haman, who hates the people of God and wouldn't have any interest in the God of Abraham or Jacob, he's accidentally consulting the one true God who guided him to these dates because providentially God was ordering the time in just the right way that circumstances would unfold in just the right way. So Esther would be in the right place with her relationship with Xerxes and everything else would happen just so that his chosen people would be delivered. You see what I'm saying, right? If we view this as a dirty thing that the bad guy is doing, then we might miss a very important moment in the providential deliverance of God, the providential work of God in this story, if we instead view it as something more value neutral or as something that, well, occasionally in the Bible, even if it does make you scratch your head, God seems to use for his purposes of communicating or nudging people in the way that he wants to. I have a bunch more that I would like to cover on this topic. Maybe it'll come up naturally as we move forward in Esther, but maybe I'll do a video over on the YouTube channel about it as well. I think this is really, really interesting stuff. Can you believe how long this miserable cold is hanging on for me? I'm doing my best. Thanks for your patience with my voice. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.